So it is my great pleasure and honor, on behalf of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies, to present today Professor Linda Kay, who, like me, got her graduate degree here at Concordia University. So we're both alum, or whatever you call it. So Professor Kay has a wonderful heritage of a strong journalism background, and she's written for many wonderful journals and newspapers, including the Gazette, which I don't include in the wonderful.
It used to be wonderful.
Used to be, right?
A long time ago.
But alongside the
Your
Chicago
corner of
Tribune.
it is still wonderful.
Right, the Chicago Tribune and other really interesting and very impressive journals and newspapers. And she is the winner of the Dean's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Her area of research, which brings her here today, is pioneering female journalists in Canada. She has authored a number of books, one of which, The Sweet 16, which details the journey that resulted in the formation of Canadian Women's Press Club. So I don't want to speak more about her CV, which is quite impressive, except to note that she has worked on journalists who have been challenged by reporting about trauma incidents, and also about one of the things that my graduate students and I have worked on is the reflexive, writing the personal I, the eyewitness. We've been working on memoirs and how we trust or don't trust memoir writing. So the I present, the eyewitness, is a very interesting thing. Today we're going to hear of her work, which is a project that she's been working on research in progress, on the work of Ida Seigler Bension Wynn, who became in 1918 the first Jewish woman to serve as an editor-in-chief of a newspaper in Canada. She was a Romanian refugee, and I am really happy to present Professor Linda Kay and to hear the product of her research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Norma. And hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. This whole journey actually started here last year at this seminar where I talked about Ida, who I had discovered because I was researching women journalists, pioneers, and I noticed that all the early pioneers were white and Christian. And I started to think, when did the first ethnic people come into this profession, women? And I was at an old used bookstore, and I came across a book called 100 Years in the Canadian Jewish Press. And I'm like, what? And I look in the index very rapidly, and I find one woman. And this is the woman that I'm going to speak about. So rarely does one person's journey encapsulate the passion that drives a movement. Canadian journalist Ida Seigler's larger-than-life story illuminates the forces that fueled the Zionist movement and expands our understanding of the complicated relationships that resulted and endure until the present day. 100 years after the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Seigler's journalism and her advocacy, which is something I didn't know about when I started researching her as a journalist, provide an insider's chronicle of the Zionist movement and the motivations and actions that continue to shape our world. An influential female journalist in a field completely dominated by men, and a fervent organizer for the cause of a Jewish homeland. Seigler left a legacy of words and deeds that allow us to better understand complex historical events that continue to reverberate. So I call this the search for a home. The search for a home was a preoccupation from an early age for Ida Seigler. Her quest reverberates today as the refugee crisis expands in Europe, and we remember that displacement has been a recurrent theme for centuries when the innocent have been forced to flee persecution or war. Ida Seigler's family fled Romania in the aftermath of the 1881 pogroms. She was a toddler, and this is a bit of a puzzle for me because women journalists lied about their age. And I have 3 different ages for Ida. And depending on which census I look at, which naturalization papers I look at, I am really not sure, but I do believe she was a toddler. I don't think she was 5. I think she was 2 when the family fled. But if you would ask her husband, he would say she wasn't even born then. Because she never told her real age to her husband. So we'll get to that later. So the family settled in Montreal, where an unlikely story that could have been pulled from literature unfolded for the eldest daughter. Her father, Abraham, owned a small grocery. The family had little money, and her mother, Millie, did not approve of an education for girls. But defying the limited expectations set for her, Ida won a scholarship to high school, published her first article before age 20, and I say that not knowing for sure exactly how old she was, taught English grammar to writers who knew only Yiddish, and became, in 1918, editor-in-chief of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, predecessor to today's Canadian Jewish News. She's the first Jewish woman in Canada to occupy both the top position on a newspaper and write the paper's lead editorial. And to tell you, this is absolutely astounding, because writing the paper's lead editorial, this is where the paper expresses its voice. And men did this. Women didn't do this. And I, at one point, thought she might be the only woman, and she may be, and I hesitate with the only word. A journalist always hesitate with the only word, because there's always an exception to the only. But I do believe she may be the only woman to occupy both those positions, not just the only Jewish woman. And why I say this is because she was hired by a man, and there are instances of women who had started their own paper and wrote an editorial, but she was hired by someone else to be the editor-in-chief, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So, she was hired by Hirsch Velovsky. Now, he's the man without the beard. He's sitting with a rabbi here in this picture. So Ida was hired by him, and Velovsky was the founder of the Eagle Publishing Company, managing editor of the leading Yiddish paper in Canada, and publisher of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle. And that, at the time, was the leading English language paper of its kind in Canada. He appointed Ida Seigler editor-in-chief in 1918, entrusting her with running the weekly paper and writing the editorial on the front page of the paper. So why did he hire her? I can only speculate why. But in the book that I told you that I found in the used bookstore, one critic called her a brilliant journalist, and another said, quote, "She lifted Jewish journalism out of its narrow aspect, unworldly approach, and vigorous orthodoxy by bringing liberalism, modernity, worldliness, lightness, and swing." So she was obviously a very talented writer, a very brilliant woman. So he entrusts her to edit the paper and, to manage it and to write the lead editorial. Now, most women hired by newspapers in those days edited what is called the woman's page of the newspaper. This started in the late 1800s. Savvy businessmen who ran these newspapers knew that attracting women readers, you would have to have something of interest for women. So this was the woman's page. So each paper hired one woman to write this page, and in the dailies it usually ran on the Saturday paper, and it was one full page, and it was domestic advice, advice to the lovelorn, housekeeping tips, social gossip. And the crazy thing about it is these women who were writing it were working women, obviously they were working. They weren't at home doing these things. They didn't have children, almost uniformly did not have children. And they didn't really know how to do the things that they were writing about. But nevertheless, this was an outlet for them. These were talented women who had a paying outlet for their writing. So, interestingly enough, the Chronicle did have a women's page. And it was conducted by a woman named Jessie Abrams. Who was Jessie Abrams? Well, I've discovered through my research that she was Ida Seigler.
Huh.
Ida Seigler wrote the lead editorial, and she also wrote the women's page under the name Jessie Abrams. Her first editorial appeared on December 18th, 1918, with the headline, "Are We Mere Spectators?" She expresses anger that a delegation of American Jews at a peace conference in London did not include any Canadians. She writes, "Are we to have no voice in the momentous questions that are agitating world Jewry? We Canadian Jews have many representative men, keen, intelligent men of wide vision and broad views, men who have not been ashamed to acknowledge their loyal adherence to Jewish ideals while helping to build up this Canada of ours. The time has come for these men to come forward, because the Jewish people of Canada need leaders to formulate their views and to express them. Even modesty may be selfish, and the lot of the leader is to sacrifice self in the interest of the people." So that was her first editorial. She wrote about juvenile delinquents, which was so interesting to me. She's urging her readers who are immersed in national and international problems not to forget or minimize local concerns. She writes, "We have been told time and again that the number of Jewish juvenile delinquents is altogether out of proportion to our numbers, yet we have done nothing to check the danger." She writes about a little tempest that arose over renting a public school to the Shar Hashemayan congregation for Sunday school classes. There's a professor who is arguing against renting the school, and he states that pupils at the school are imbibing racial animosity ever since it was noted that Jews were occupying the school on Sundays. Ida does not agree with the professor. She writes in favor. "The average Christian child could meet the average Jewish child on a friendly footing and do more towards strengthening the bond of Canadian citizenship than all the teaching and preaching in the world." When Sir Wilfrid Laurier died in 1919, Ida mourned the loss. Laurier had many rare gifts, she wrote, not the least of which was his sympathetic, broad-minded attitude towards the opinions of others. We Jews have a special cause to remember that and to feel grateful. Those of our people who had occasion to seek his assistance found him easy to approach, kindly and sympathetic. And as an oppressed people, victims of wrong, we found him ready to champion our cause and see that justice was done to us. We admired him. We respected him. We were proud of him. But greater than all else, we loved him. Mr. Velovsky went to Carlsbad. He was attending a conference, and it was a Zionist conference. And so Ida, I guess, engineered that all the people in the newsroom would write a letter wishing him well, and this was in 21, and hoping that he had a great trip, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to read the letter, part of it. She starts off, "We miss you around here." And then the second paragraph, "Too bad you weren't here for the arrival of the orphans. It was a very wonderful sight, and you would have enjoyed it, I know." There were a movement to take orphans from the Ukraine to Canada, and they tried to, from my understanding, get 1,000 orphans here. They were able to get 200, and many of them came to Quebec. So she writes that, but the last graph is particularly interesting. I hope that by this time you've picked me out a nice husband. Be sure to bring his photograph with you. Now, there was a lot of pressure on women to get married at that time, and any woman who was a working woman was expected to leave her job when she got married. And I know from reading letters that are in the archives that there was pressure. Her mother did not approve of her working, and her mother really, the best thing she could have done in life was to get married and find a husband. So there was pressure. In any event, she seems to have gone with the flow. And in her last is kindest regards to Mr. Kaiserman. If you see him, hoping you are enjoying your trip to the utmost, I remain, yours sincerely. And then there follow a whole sheaf of letters in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and English that are written by the employees. He was born in Jerusalem in 1887, and I do think he gave his right date, and descended from two distinguished Sephardic families. He was educated in the yeshiva of his grandfather in Jerusalem and studied to become a rabbi. He attended universities in Germany and Switzerland, was said to be the first Middle Eastern Sephardic Jew to have studied there, graduating as a doctor of philosophy and Oriental philology at the University of Bern. He served briefly as rabbi of the Belgrade Sephardic community. An ardent Zionist, Bension became an active worker in the Kerem Haysad when it was established in 1920, and he visited every Sephardic community in the diaspora, in Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Central and South America, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, which was Aden, India, China, and Japan, and aroused a number of communities formerly unknown. He is said to be the first to bring the Marranos of Portugal to the notice of world Jewry in 1921. He founded a Sephardic Zionist fundraising body and worked very hard for an Arab-Jewish entente. Critics say that Bension was the last of the Kabbalists who wrote with deep perception on outstanding Muslim Sufis. He would later write the Zohar in Muslim and Christian Spain, which was hailed at the time as the finest study of Jewish mysticism. So, the interview. She interviews him about his fundraising activities. She writes it up as Jesse Abrams. And the next thing we know, just one more thing before that. Bension traveled in rarefied circles. This is in a letter from Albert Einstein that is in the archives, Jewish Public Library archives. And I had it translated, but what I want to tell you as background to it is that when Bension was going around the world trying to raise money, he got a donation in Basra of 140,000 pounds from a Mr. Ezekiel Shem-Tov. The gift was legalized in court, a trustee was appointed, and a committee to oversee the money was struck. Bension was one, James de Rothschild, David Yedlin, Chaim Weitzman, and Professor Albert Einstein. So Einstein is writing here, and at the end he says, he's writing to Mr. Shem-Tov, I must express my deep appreciation to you for the tremendous support and your generous disposition have bestowed upon the settlement of Palestine. As long as our nation can rely on such admirable sons, we have no need to worry about its future. Naturally, I accept the vote of the Board of Trustees and have in this sense reported back to Dr. Bension. So they were working together. So Ida interviews Bension, writes a story under the name Jesse Abrams. Why does she do it under that name? Well, they've fallen in love. It's love at first sight. They get married secretly at Temple Emmanuel a few weeks after the interview. Then they do formalize in a wedding in London the following year, but it's all very hush-hush. And I don't know this for a fact, but I think she wrote that article under Jesse Abrams because she knew already that she was not objective about this man, and that she was falling in love with him.
Did her parents object, or did his?
At the Temple Emmanuel, the witnesses are two people that I can't even figure out who they are. The parents were definitely not there. I don't know whether they took people who were just like in the corridor or the secretary. I have to do research on that, but it was definitely hush-hush. Now, the other reason it could have been so quick is he was leaving. And he was going on his fundraising mission, and he had intended to leave, and he wanted to take her with him to New York because he was meeting with a very wealthy, influential person from Bombay called Kadoorie. And he wanted to pitch Kadoorie, and I think they wanted to legitimize it in the eyes of the Lord before they went to New York together, and that's what they did a couple of weeks later. And they stayed in a hotel. And, I'm sure the mother knew about it. She may not have known that they were married, but I would think. I would think because she writes a letter from the Commodore Hotel to her mother saying, "I'm glad I finally made you proud." So I think she told her in some way. They didn't come to the ceremony, but she told her in some way.
Both Shem Tov and Kadoorie are Iraqi Jews. And for them, fundraising as a married man would have been more established and appropriate.
Thank you. I always learn. So the newlyweds quickly embark on a mission, which is traveling the world in support of a Jewish homeland. Now, my presentation is entitled In Search of a Home. They were in search of a homeland, really. But what's so ironic, and I'm going to say this now because I don't want to forget it, is that they never had a home together. And I'll talk about that in a minute. They traveled relentlessly. In 1926, they took an extensive tour of the Jewish communities in South America. They were united by common interest and considerable zeal. She spoke to women, he spoke to men, arousing the dormant Jewish consciousness. In some communities, people who had never been known locally as Jews were attracted to the meetings. Ida brought together small groups of Jewish women, and she laid the foundation for the Women's International Zionist Organization, WIZO, in countries throughout South America. And I found traces of her work in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, and they do attribute her with being the driving force. As they traveled, Ida continued writing articles for various Jewish publications on a freelance basis, including Israel's Messenger, based in Shanghai. Upon seeing Israel for the first time with her husband, and this wasn't until 1928, they'd been together since 25, she hasn't seen Israel. They've been traveling. She wrote an exuberant letter to N.E.B. Ezra of Shanghai, editor and founder of Israel's Messenger, which he published. Quote, "You must forgive me for letting my enthusiasm run away with me. Palestine fills one with such unbounded enthusiasm that one feels one must shout from the hilltop so that all the world may hear how wonderful, how very much worthwhile is this thing we are doing. Israel is growing as beautifully as our dream would have it, though not fast enough for our hungry souls. We fain would wake up in the morning and find that long night of suffering has vanished, that the new day has brought a complete new life, the sweet realization of hope so long deferred. But no, we have the joy of laboring for it ourselves, of seeing even the tiniest blade of grass blossom only under our own hands." So they're traveling like crazy. By 1929, the couple are in China, they go to India, and I was able to trace a lot of their travels through papers, through newspapers, because it was covered. Their travel was covered. He gave lectures, she gave lectures. 1931 finds them traveling in Europe, where illness overtakes Bension during a campaign in Portugal. He is transferred to the American hospital in Paris, where operations of an undisclosed nature are performed. And after several months in the hospital, he dies in 1932 at age 45. They've only been together for 7 years. The likely cause is cancer, although it's never mentioned in any of the articles. Ida brings his body to Palestine for burial. The funeral procession stops in Tel Aviv, where Rabbi Uziel, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, Uziel, pays tribute in the Great Synagogue, and Bension is buried on the Mount of Olives. Ida continues his work after his death. In 1933, with a desperate situation developing in Europe, she writes in French an article aimed at Jewry in Egypt and headlined Les Juifs d'Allemagne où aller. She writes that Einstein himself stated that only Palestine offers a land of refuge for persecuted Jews. She writes, protests are good. This is, I'm translating from the French. Protests are good. Solidarity is fine. Boycotts of the enemy are excellent. But where will they go? Aid your brothers in a practical manner. She makes a plea for donations to organize immigration, establish the immigrants in colonies, procure work for them, construct schools, hospitals, and synagogues, and she notes that millions of Jews from Germany, Poland, and Romania are seeking a home. In 1935 and 36, as a missionary for the Women's International Zionist Organization, quote-unquote missionary, she undertakes a lecture tour of Great Britain and Ireland, speaking in private homes, attempting to rally her sisters to work for a Palestinian homeland, discussing the position of the Jewish people in Germany. She speaks of the reconstruction work in Palestine and the courage displayed by Jews in the face of the present upheaval. In March of 37, she's in Belgium for meetings in Brussels and Antwerp. By May of that year, she's arrived in Australia, visiting Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, and Melbourne, where she carries out an intensive propaganda organization and fundraising campaign among the women of the Jewish communities there. By October of the same year, she is sailing out of New Zealand, destined for San Francisco, likely destined for Mexico, as far as I can see, because she visited there in 1938, creating a WIZO there, and then proceeding to Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, where political conditions were in a state of tension, which prevents the furtherance of Zionist work. She nevertheless goes to Rio and Sao Paulo, where meetings are arranged for her in private homes. By the end of 39, she was back in Australia to strengthen existing WIZO groups. That trip would change her life. She marries widow Samuel Wynn, a wealthy wine merchant and a staunch Zionist. He's in the picture, and I don't know who the other woman is. That's Ida in the middle. And you'll note that she's particularly fashionable, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So in Samuel Wynn, Ida found an ally. He was not religious, but in defense of his Jewish culture and the Zionist cause, he was as tenacious as was his approach to business. And Ida spends the rest of her life with him in Australia. During that time in Australia, her niece and nephew come to visit her in Melbourne for a year. Now, this is an interesting sidelight. She never had children, but her sister Bessie had a son, Arnold, and a daughter, Isabel. And Ida was very close to them. So she urged them to come and be with her in Melbourne. And they went to school there. Well, actually, it was Arnold who went to school because Isabel was already, had a failed marriage. And she was sort of recuperating from that. Why do I mention this in particular? Because Arnold, who was 15 when he went there, he adored his aunt. And he later credited her, because he became quite famous, with giving him the confidence that he needed to go off in life and do what he eventually did. While he was there, Yehudi Menuhin was a dinner guest at the home of Ida and Samuel Wynn. And one day, well, Arnold says in his memoir that he was quite silent at the dinner table because he was in awe of the violinist, and he didn't know what to say, and he was 15 and he felt very insecure. Anyway, he is coming home from school the next day and he runs into Menuhin on the street. And Menuhin praises him and says, you know, you're great, you got a great future, you're really terrific, you're gonna go places. And he comes home and he says to Ida, why did he notice me? Like, why? And she said, because you're very special and you're gonna go places. And he later said that he credits her with sending him on his path. He became a world famous designer, clothing designer, and he was known as Skazi. It's Isaac spelled backwards, and he designed for every first lady from Mamie Eisenhower to Hillary Clinton, for Elizabeth Taylor. Thank you, Elizabeth Taylor. Joan Crawford, who's in the previous picture, Sophia Loren, and his probably most famous, well-known client was Barbra Streisand. And yeah, and they were like inseparable for years and years. So she's in Melbourne. They go back home. She becomes president of the Wizzo Federation of Australia, and she's described as the most outstanding woman in the history of Australian Zionism, building Australia's Wizzo to over 4,000 members. On July 12th, 1948, she has a heart attack and dies a few weeks later. At her death, Seigler is remembered as, quote, the first Zionist woman to talk to the black Jews of Cochin, the B'nai Israel of Bombay, the Chinese Jews of Kai Fan Pho, the Moranos of Portugal, the first temple.
Questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah, we can ask questions. I'm not going to begin the questions. I'll just make one statement. Boy, did she travel.
So she never had a home except when she settled in Australia with him?
It's amazing how much, we complain about traveling now, but then they really had to spend time traveling. She was all over the place. Okay, any questions before we have lunch, when you'll be able to discuss things privately with Professor Kay? Are there any specific questions? Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, you talked about a trip that changed her life. Was it in Australia?
Yes, it was in Australia. Yeah, that was the first time she had a home.
Can we know which husband she loved more, or we just can't?
Totally been seeing.
Bension. She
Totally.
was in love with him.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
I found a relative who
First
said,
loves.
yeah, the love of her life.
Yeah.
That was him. So sad, 7 years they held together, but they did so much.
Yeah.
They were all over the world.
Was she a Zionist before she met him, or you think
Yes.
she was?
I
already?
sense she was, yes. And
Okay.
I don't know that much about Velovsky. That's another thing I've got to investigate,
Okay.
but I assume he was.
Yes,
Yes, he was.
He was going to Europe as a delegate to the Zionist Congress,
Yeah,
and he also spent part of that time visiting Palestine. He wrote a memoir of that of that trip, and presumably, you know, it was in jest, but she was saying, you know, I'm sure you're going to find a nice guy for me. You know, probably at the Zionist Congress, you know, because, you know, if you're matchmaking for that woman, you know, you would probably want to match her, probably a strong Zionist, with another one who is a very big supporter of the Zionist cause.
Well, I found this letter later, and when I saw the letter, I thought, okay, maybe he did fix her up, but there's a gap. This letter was written in 21. She doesn't meet Ariel until 24, And my sense is, because I found an article in the Jewish Chronicle in London where they were interviewing Ida after her marriage, and they put it very charmingly. They say, Dr. Bension was visiting North America when a journalistic encounter, well, an encounter not of a journalistic kind, changed his life. So I take it that maybe he did try, but it wasn't Bension at the time, that, you know, it took a few more years before things.
You know, there were many women in the first couple of decades of the 20th century who were single for a long time or remained single, who accomplished many things and never married, and were significantly independent, active, talented, and skilled. And there were all kinds of debates amongst historians. Were they so active because they never married, or they never married because they were so active? All kinds of questions. But she married and kept up her activity. Rebecca Gratz also never married, never had children. She took care of her nieces and nephews, 6 kids. So her nieces and nephews and the non-fertile couple were also a significant
Very interesting.
factor.
The other great example is Henrietta Zoll.
Henrietta Zoll, who never married, achieved many things, including Hadassah, but not just Hadassah, Youth Aliyah, many things. But she actually fell in love with a man who never married her, never gave her
Well,
credit.
he married another
He
woman.
married somebody else, and never gave her credit for all her work in the Legends of the Jews that she did.
Yeah.
So. But the pseudonym thing, the thing of women's page, and either using a man's name or not using your own name is very interesting, because that was having a woman's page or stuff for women was very common at that point, and even General Mills had Betty Crocker. There was no such person as Betty Crocker. That was totally made up, so that women would buy the product and listen to this advice from Betty Crocker, because it was a woman giving advice. There was no such person, and it was, in the beginning, it was a man writing this advice to buyers of Betty Crocker products.
In those days, all these companies had some women giving recipes and.
But often it wasn't a woman.
No, they never even existed, they just were.
He was often made. Crocker was the name of the man who owned the company.
Oh, really?
Ah,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. And Betty was what they thought would be a good American, very American name.
Yes.
I'm wondering, why did her parent object to their marriage so much? Was it because they were in different backgrounds, or because they felt he traveled too much and it wasn't stable? And I don't know, why did they get married, especially in the Temple Emmanuel? Why did it have to be that? Because their parents didn't agree, and the parents in another synagogue, they would have to sign papers, etc.?
I don't think that they objected to her getting married to him. I think that they might have been conflicted as to the speed of it. They may have wanted a big deal, and she wanted to get married right away. And so that might have been it, because they're not present at the temple.
But they might have objected to him being Sephardic.
You think so?
They were Romanian.
Okay, Norma, you might know this. In Quebec in those years, were bans,
Yes, you needed
enforced?
bans, and they were enforced. You needed many.
in other words, you needed several weeks
You needed several
notice
weeks,
to
no,
make a
months.
form.
Not weeks, months.
Okay, so you needed a considerable period beforehand before you could formally get married.
Right. And if the rabbi who married them did it without publishing the bans, he could be put in jail for violating the civil code.
So that's another good reason for it to be hush-hush.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
at the Temple Emmanuel, they weren't married by the rabbi there at the time?
They were.
they
They
were.
were, but they didn't.
That's
publish
Rabbi
them.
Stern.
Well, he did it quietly, so he may
I
publish the
have his name,
bans
but I don't have it.
3 times in the same week, and that wasn't exactly kosher.
Maybe he classed it as a religious wedding solely.
He wasn't allowed to do that. That's
Oh.
against the civil code.
But I think that for religious Jews, you could do that. You can go to a Beth Din, you can get
Well,
married.
It's against
No,
the
no, no.
Quebec civil code. If the Vaad does it, it's illegal.
It doesn't matter what kind of rabbi you are,
Doesn't
you can
matter.
get prosecuted.
And for which the rabbis were paid 25 cents.
It's a living.
Well, this just opens up something for me to investigate because it was quick. And-
Yeah.
Yeah, and so.
And that may be
hush,
the
hush.
reason, hush hush, because he may have advised them, let's just do it quickly. If you need it quickly, but we can't invite anybody.
Yeah.
And then the people may have been, in fact, people who worked in his office, the secretarial staff, so that nobody would know about it.
I think that's what it was.
You know, and-
Look up who worked in the office then.
You know, and also, as you were saying, you know, for an unmarried couple in the 1920s to cohabit in a hotel room was, I think, formally against the law.
Yeah,
Really.
and the hotel could be in trouble. There were so many issues of the civil code that were implicated.
I know it happened really, really fast because they were married before they went to New York. And because the date on the letters, you know, I matched it up. But in that letter that she writes to her mother saying, I made you happy at last, she writes to her about how he insisted on this incredible diamond ring for her.
Mhm.
And so they were already married, but, you know, they were just buying the ring. And how they went around to Tiffany's and she told him, this is too expensive. No. Mm-mm. And so they left and they went shopping and then they ended up back at Tiffany's and he got her the ring. And it was the same ring that Queen Mary had received. So, anyway.
So how about we, oh, you have a question and then we'll.
Well, just a comment. First of all, thank you for your presentation and letting us make the acquaintance of such a marvelous person and, well, a marvelous couple, I should say, too. My comment is that about Chodori. His, well, the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community at the time was Sir Eliezer Chodori. He was a very wealthy man, and his, I don't know if it was he who
Was there? It may have been. I think it might have been. She just refers to him as Mr. Kaduri, but she also at one point calls him the old man. So I don't know how he
it's
would have
probably
been.
him.
But you said the Kaduri of India, in India.
It's the same family.
But it's the same family, but it would have been a different Kaduri. The Kaduri from Baghdad would not have been in India.
He went to India.
He sent his
frequently.
sons there or his
That's
cousins,
true.
but not necessarily him.
Not necessarily.
They also went to China too, because some friends of mine visited the Kaduri family in China.
They had family members, but the old man himself
Oh,
did
the old
not
man.
necessarily,
That's-
not necessarily.
The old man was there in New York, but there were also other Kaduris
Yeah,
there.
it's a large family and a very popular name in the community. So there's a Kaduri who came here. Once they had to leave, then it's a different, in the 1950s they left, so then it's a different situation. You
But
want
my
us to have
question
lunch.
is, do you get a sense of how, today it's very easy to sort of do injustice to the ideological makeup of the time, the 20s and 30s, when Zionism wasn't necessarily even the most popular strain. I mean, in Canada, there were many Bundists, there were many Trotskyists. Do you get a sense of her relationship to those other currents in?
I know that she spoke to those people, she was a fervent Zionist though. He was very, I think, more accommodating. But, you know, this is giving me things to think about, what you're saying. But there definitely was a lot of, as you know, opposition to what was going on in various places that they went. But they were really there to get money for a homeland.
Right.
Yeah.